I wanted to stop here for two reasons. One is, we talked about many different courtyards being in this neighborhood, most of which date obviously from the 18th and 19th century. They're common in this neighborhood. Here's an example of a 20th century courtyard. So the idea, the principle of courtyards is really a good one if you think about it, because it provides you with kind of a sanctuary from all of the hubbub and noise around and traffic. So this is kind of a modern reinterpretation of that. And the difference, of course, is that the courtyard was primarily created for cars as opposed to people. I mean, it's used by both, but I just thought it was kind of interesting how things progress over time. The other reason why I stopped here, within the historic photos, which was one of your handouts, one of them shows a very crowded courtyard, an alleyway almost, with a bunch of people. And that location is where we're standing. So 322 Fitzwater is out here. So the alley behind it was right about here. So I talked about, after the Civil War, that there was wave after wave of immigration coming into the city. What was the result of that? Well, I'll tell you, overcrowding was one of those results. What ended up happening is that throughout this neighborhood and the city in general, single-family dwellings were divided up to take advantage of this influx and to rent out rooms. So it was common for rooms to be rented out to families, not individuals, to families. So if you subdivide houses like was commonly done here, and you went from one family to up to 10 families in a bigger home, and you times that by hundreds of buildings, what do you think the result's going to be?
A strain on
it's nasty. Yeah, it's nasty. Not only was there heaps of trash in streets throughout this neighborhood, crime dramatically increased. I mean, how could you stand it? Everybody has a breaking point. Epidemics, plagues swept through here. If you had lived in the late 19th century in the city of Philadelphia and somebody said, "Why don't you meet me down at 3rd and Catherine?" Your reaction would have been, "What are you, crazy? I'm not going down there." This was, unfortunately, at the time, one of the least desirable areas in the city of Philadelphia. And it was primarily for those reasons. Certainly wasn't the fault of the people here, it was the conditions. Didn't stop the immigration, did it?
No.
So we talked before, Poles, Catholic Poles settled along 2nd Street, the waterfront, primarily dock workers. Eastern Europeans who were Jews came primarily to 4th Street and settled what became Fabric Row, which is our next stop on the tour. And just beyond here, of course, anybody who's a local know that the Italians settled on 8th and 9th Street. So that's how the area is subdivided and developed and continued really through much of the 20th century. Also within that packet of information I gave you, the historic photos, which show the alleyway that we just came from. The other image is from this corner, looking in this direction back in the 1920s when Fabric Row was already well established by many of the Jewish immigrants that had come into this area. Also, when you get a chance to look at that image, I don't want you to pull it out now because it's going to get wet, you'll notice carts for fruits and vegetables. That was also common throughout these commercial districts in the city. If you think about being an immigrant and coming into the city, one of the few ways that you can make money right away is to do something like buy a cart, fill it with fruits and vegetables, and sell them. That's the way people started to establish themselves. Fabric Row is famous in Philadelphia because it's been here for more than a century, and in some cases, several generations of the same family continue to own their business here. Now I say that, and also the caveat being that the neighborhood and the street is changing pretty dramatically. So as we walk up 4th Street, I would like you to take note of how some of the buildings are being restored and new businesses that are moving in, mostly young entrepreneurs who are here not to serve the city, but really to serve the neighbors. So it's another example of how not only this area is changing, but how it's becoming more higher class, more refined, if I could use that term. Change is inevitable, and the change in this case is something that you'll see just walking up 4th Street. So Beautiful 18th century homes, huh? Surprised they survived Bainbridge Street, considering all the changes that have taken place here. One thing you may or may not know before we end the tour is this is a very wide street because there used to be markets here, just like there were on Market Street. Very similar to what you see that's left at 2nd and Pine, New Market. So you can imagine market sheds going up and down Bainbridge. So this was a very bustling area, and it continues to be. Before I say another word, I do want to thank you for enduring the weather and sticking with the tour. I really appreciate that. But I did want to wrap up the tour by bringing us up to the present and actually taking at least a glimpse of what you might expect in the future. In the most recent chapter of the history of this neighborhood, things really changed when Independence, the park I work for, Independence National Historical Park, was established. That was in 1948. The result of that was the redevelopment of not only the historic core of Philadelphia, which you now see as the park, but the offshoot of that, of course, was the redevelopment of Society Hill. That was such a successful project and a model for redevelopment that it, of course, over time crept below South Street. So real estate people, knowing a good thing when they see it, decided that South Philly needed to be, at least this part of it, renamed Queen Village. We got to come up with a good name to attract new residents, and that happened, I think, in the 1980s. So you had that after the bicentennial, you had people starting to come below South Street, primarily on streets like Monroe and Catherine, the northern edge of the area, and started redeveloping their properties. They were urban pioneers in this area, and then things accelerated, slowly but surely, but then things accelerated about 10 years ago. And within the last decade, redevelopment here has really been widespread, and actually not only has gone south, as you know, but has gone beyond Washington Avenue, which is something most people didn't expect to happen for a while. What does all this mean? Well, for one thing, you'd be interested to know that in the almost 350-year history of this neighborhood, this is the first time that this part of South Philadelphia is wealthy. It has never, ever really been a wealthy community. It's been working class. When we were back in the 18th century, we talked about some merchants being sprinkled among the population. But, so that's a big change. That's a sea change. And what does that mean for the neighborhood? Well, I think you see that, or those changes taking place now, and they have been for years. Finer restaurants are moving into the neighborhood. Even South Street, which continues to change, and it's struggling in some respects, has added more upscale stores. I mean, it's morphing, it's changing, and the same is happening on 4th Street. So anybody, the bottom line is anybody who owns property here, you know, the golden rule of real estate is location, location, location. You made a good purchase. Even though the market's down, I can almost guarantee you, not that I'm a real estate expert, based on the history and how things have developed, this area is going to continue to redevelop and attract even wealthier people, which is both good and bad. Because one of the results of that is, you know, values go up, taxes go up, you know the story. But the other thing that happened that really changed this area dramatically was the fact that the Crosstown Expressway was not built here. Back in the 1960s, just like the Vine Street Expressway was built to the north, the original plan was to duplicate that here. So between South Street and Bainbridge, they were going to tear everything down and create an expressway. And successfully, neighbors fought that. But in the intervening years, and it took about a decade for this to happen, for them to be successful in the courts, bohemians, artists, started populating South Street and taking what were vacated properties, because everybody was evicted, at very low rents and creating a scene, which continues today. It's a lesser known chapter of local history, but I think a really interesting one that still continues to impact the neighborhood, both good and bad. So what do you think is going to happen in the future? I gave you some indication. It's going to continue to be more upscale, attract more money. If you envision Queen Village 10 years from now, what do you see? Do you see any dramatic changes taking place here? What's that?
Casino.
Casino, yeah, there's always that. What else do you think might happen that would really change this area significantly? How did the neighborhood start? Way back when it started. Where was all the action? On the river. Right? The city finally has a master plan for redeveloping, which has been adopted formally. So my guess would be that all the action's going to change and move down to the waterfront. And the area right at Washington Avenue North, going up to what is now Penn's Landing, there'll be massive redevelopment there. Once it gets started, high-rise residential towers, whether you like it or not, I think that's what's going to happen. Marinas, park greenways, which will be very nice. You can run on or bike on. I mean, the river is really where the future of this neighborhood is, just like it was centuries ago when everything started. So for what it's worth, that's my prediction. Anyway, thank you again so much for coming on the tour. Really appreciate sticking with it despite the weather. And thank you too for supporting the Queen Village Neighbors Association. All of the proceeds of this tour go to the association. And I actually earmarked the money to continue beautification of Beck Park, that little pocket park that we went into. And anybody who's a local resident knows that as few as 2 or 3 years ago, it didn't look that way. So it's been redeveloped by the neighbors mostly into a really nice little park. So that's where your money's going. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. You're welcome. You're coming. I hope you learned a few things. I'll bet you did, but that's good.